So tonight, maybe I will focus on one aspect only, which is the popular resistance. And I was thinking it would be good to put stories, inspiring stories in more detail, because when you're trying to summarize 130 years of popular resistance in a 300-page book, you're basically going to write one sentence on every decade or something. It's really very hard to do it justice. So I thought instead I'll take 13 good stories of good acts of resistance and put them in a book, which I call it "To Exist is to Resist," basically a summary of inspiring Palestinian stories. And I may show you a couple of those stories and talk to you about those. But anyway, in the news in the past few days, of course, were a lot of bad news, if you want, all around. There's home demolitions. There's friends of ours who died, like Mazim, who was basically a Palestinian hero. His legs were chopped off when they bombed his car, the Israeli terrorist underground, basically. Also, a friend of ours, this guy on the left, he died of cancer. He was a foremost authority on Hamas, actually, an academic. He was also a blind guy, and from birth, and he helped dismantle the fence around Haisha refugee camp as that happened. But anyway, he left two wonderful children, his wife. I feel very bad about losing him. We remember the loss of families like this one in 2014. 5 years ago, this family was killed. The father, the mother, and the 5 children were killed when Israel bombed their apartment building in Gaza. As mentioned, there are 2 books that are out there. One is called Sharing the Land of Canaan, one is Popular Resistance in Palestine. The Sharing the Land of Canaan is more the diagnostic book, if you want, what has happened, and also the prognosis that we would have to live together and what's a modality of living together. And it's what I call academic in many aspects, except the last chapter where I explain a bit about what people can do. And that last chapter is actually the one that led to many people saying, "Why don't you write about popular resistance?" And I said, well, I don't write about things I don't practice. And I have done very little popular resistance at that time in 2004. And then subsequently, Jessie, my wife, was here, and I returned to Palestine in 2008, and I started practicing popular resistance, was arrested many times. And in the process, I started writing about my own observations on popular resistance, what works, what doesn't work, mostly for my own. I write books, and I wrote several books, but I write them mostly so that I can understand what's going on. So I wanted to understand what is this thing about uprisings. For example, why do they come and go? Why do you have a wave? And I found out there's reasons for this that one has to understand. And that people used to say the first uprising, 1987 or something. And I discovered through research that actually it was the 1987 uprising was actually number 13 in our uprisings. So we had the first uprising, if you want, or first intifada in 1881. And, I didn't know this history. They don't teach it at school. They don't tell us our successes. They tell us what politicians did or do. They tell us what Yasser Arafat did, what Sharon or Peres or Rabin or something else. But they won't tell us what the people do. And I was, before I came back to Palestine, I was in the US, where I used to read a lot of progressive literature in the US. For example, there's a book by Howard Zinn called The People's History of the United States. So you should read it. It's a remarkable book about how people are the ones who make history, not the politicians. You know, Johnson was not the one who brought civil rights. It was the people pushing Johnson and people like him. So it's not electing whether you elect Labour or Tory or whatever. It's how the people push to affect the change. And so it's really people's movement, so you need the people's history. And that also gave me the idea we need the people's history of Palestine. And this book on popular resistance is a very tiny step in that direction. There's actually, after I finished that, I realized there's so many more areas. I actually list them even in the last chapter. I say, for example, I think there needs to be a book on the women movement in Palestine in terms of the popular resistance on students and how they did their resistance, student unions, things like that. So there's a lot of, you know, this is the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of knowledge that needs to be done. Now, when we talk about the resistance, in my definition of resistance, it's the therapy. It's the medicine which you have to take. People don't resist because they love to resist. That's not, you know, it's not a hobby or or a passion that I resist. It's because you have to. You have to resist. If you don't resist, we're going to be in trouble as a species, as we discussed this afternoon for those of you who were there. So resistance to me is a therapy for an ailment that exists in society. We visited a museum called Peterloo, which talks about these kinds of activities and resistance here. So you know the history of the resistance here in this country, and I think you know that the resistance is the resistance to the oppression, to something unjust that we all agree is unjust. So we have to work against it. That's the therapy that I want to focus on. I do want to say very quickly, I'm going to skip through some slides because that's not the major topic of today, biodiversity, whatever, but we're the Fertile Crescent, of course, where humans first developed agriculture in humanity. That's where we first developed what's called civilization. The first communities, settled communities were there. For example, Jericho in the western part of the Fertile Crescent is the oldest continuously inhabited town on earth. And so I focus in this book on resistance, of course, is resistance to Zionism, which is a form of colonialism, racist colonialism. I don't want to get into that aspect too much, unless in the question and answer, I'm happy to answer. But Zionism is a fairly recent phenomenon, and humans in this part resisted other things in the past. For example, we resisted the Ottoman Empire, we resisted the Roman Empire, we resisted many, many things, the Egyptian invasions in Palestine, etc. So we have always had some form of resistance, but it turns out actually that our country, or our region in general, the whole western part of Asia, West Asia, I call it not the Middle East, because the Middle East is kind of colonial in mentality. But this part of the world is actually a very peaceful world. Occasionally we resist something, like we resisted the Crusaders, but generally we have been very peaceful. We had no problem and no reason to resist anything, because it was relatively quiet compared to many places in the world. And life was good, and is still good there. And I encourage those of you who haven't come to come. And I just had some falafel downstairs and some hummus. Thank you very much, Eddie, and the people downstairs. So there is some good foods if you want to come to the Middle East and try it, or even you can try it here. But we continued to live. We invented things like the bread, like beer, like wine. These are things that were invented in that part of the world. And also we invented the alphabet. These are ancestors of ours, by the way, and people of the Middle East, people of Palestine, Canaanitic people. By the way, that's a term, hence my book is called Sharing the Land of Canaan, because that's the first term that we see people describing themselves in that part of the world with. That came, of course, after the invention of the alphabet by those same people who started writing things, including description of who they are. And they said, we are the people of Canaan. Canaan is actually an Aramaic word. It means somebody who is satisfied with their lot in life. So it's because there's very nice habitats, fertile crescent, land of milk and honey, etc. So these are the Canaanites, people who are satisfied with their lot in life. And I'm one of them. These are the villages, for example. Some of these villages were destroyed, of course. This is a picture of my great-grandmother walking down the steps of the old house. This is the only picture we have of her. My grandfather is one of those kids on the right. And people invented the alphabet. They invented music and law and things like that. That are, including the alphabet that you use here comes from people in that part of the world. The A, for example, is from Aleph, which is the bull with the two horns. You flip it upside down, you get the A in English or Latin and so forth. This is the evolution of the alphabet in the western part of the land of Canaan, which you see as it evolved into medieval scripts. From these early Phoenician Aramaic. Now, since my subject is popular resistance, what are we resisting? And if you ask Palestinians today, unfortunately, even among Palestinians, there's very difficulty now that they confused us and with a very meticulous project of brainwashing and mental colonization that many Palestinians stopped even knowing what they are resisting. This is a very recent phenomenon. In the 1960s, 70s, 80s, people were very clear. If you asked them immediately, what are you resisting? Like this, they say we're resisting Zionism. Nowadays, of course, there is confusion, occupation, walls, settlements, all confuse the issues. These are symptoms, but what we were resisting is Zionism. Now, the question that you should have is, why should you resist Zionism? What's wrong with this idea of Zionism? Well, it's a very simple idea. It says that basically Jews are discriminated against in Europe, and so European Jews don't belong in Europe, and they should go and make their own state in Palestine and call it the Jewish state of Israel. This is the idea in its essence, right? It is not a very complicated idea to understand, not necessarily sympathize with or agree with, whatever, but to understand. I mean, blacks in North America were discriminated against. Most of them resisted discrimination, people like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Edwin Douglas, etc. But there was a very small minority of blacks who said, heck with it, you can't live with these white people, let's go create our own state. And they went and created their own state. You know, that state is Liberia, right? The problem for them, of course, Liberia was not a land without a people, for a people without a land. And so there was resistance to their going to Liberia and setting up this American black colony called Liberia. So the native tribes resisted them, and to this day there's a conflict and the natives still resist them. Same thing with Zionism. Zionism, which is a movement of European Jews, by European Jews, for European Jews, was about creating a Jewish state in Palestine. Palestine at the time was not Jewish and had a very tiny segment that's Jewish religion, 3% at the time of Zionist idea. came about in the late 19th century, 3% of the population was Jewish. So obviously 97% do not support creating a Jewish state, but I might venture to say that essentially all of the native 3% also resisted forming a Jewish state. Why? Because Palestine was multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious society, and everybody liked it that way, including Jews in Palestine. Jews in Palestine did not face something that invented in Europe called anti-Semitism. They lived with their neighbors. My grandfather's best friend in school was Jewish under the Ottoman Empire. My grandfather was Christian. So we lived together. We didn't care, Armenians, Christian, Muslim, Jews, Samaritans, Baha'i, people lived together. So obviously we reject, all of us, all the native people, including native Jews, and there are native Jews, by the way. We call them, of course, Arab Jews. Do you know that? Because they speak Arabic. They speak Arabic, they're native and they live with us. We have no problem with different religions. What we have a problem with an idea that says we don't like all of this diversity and we want to create a Jewish state. That is what we resisted. And the Jewish state that was created by necessity could not tolerate those people who want to maintain it as a non-Jewish, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious state. So obviously the natives had to go. And so 500 villages were destroyed, those dots, red dots on the map. And Palestinians, if you want more detail, you can read it on Pape's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. 7.5 million of us were made into refugees. 7.5 today of the Palestinians, refugees or displaced people. Now, when Israel was created in 1948, that's not the beginning of the resistance to this project. As I said, it goes back much earlier. And so we had like 15 uprisings. The first one was 1881. Why 1881? Because that's the first Zionist colony in Palestine, was Petah Tikva. Some people say Rishon LeZion nearby. But anyway, those two settlements, colonies, were built on Palestinian land, taken from Palestinian land. We were not against Jewish immigration in 1880 or 1881. We don't care. As I said, Russian Jews, for example, came after Russian pogroms and settled there, and it was no problem. Armenians came and settled there, and we have no problem. We even have an Armenian quarter in Jerusalem. And in 1881, there was also a Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, and a Christian quarter in Jerusalem, and a Muslim quarter in Jerusalem, 4 quarters. So we have no problem with diversity. We love diversity. But we have a problem when somebody comes and kicks you out of this land and says, hey, I love your house and land, and you've got to get out on the point of the gun. And of course, colonization cannot be done nicely. I cannot come and say, hey, nice house in Bristol, would you kindly move away so that I can make it the whatever I want to make it. So of course it requires violence. So violence was integral to colonization. And of course resistance is common sense. If somebody tries to force you out of your house, what would you do? You have to resist. Now, different people resist different methods. I say even animals resist in different methods. If you take a dog and poke him with a stick, after a while, depending on the breed of the dog, they may do various things, They may whine, they may scream, they may yell, they may try to bite, they may try to run away, whatever. But in any case, that's not going to be just go ahead and poke me as much as you want, That is not natural. So it is natural to have resistance. So the resistance started very early, and in this book I talk about the history of this resistance. And its subtitle is A History of Hope and Empowerment. Why it's a history of hope and empowerment? Because actually Palestinians did not fail. Palestinians succeeded beyond your imagination, actually. Certainly we were more successful than Native Americans, for example, or Aborigines, or other groups of people that suffered the same intention of destruction. I'll give you a couple of examples of successes from very early on. When we had that first uprising in 1881, who was ruling Palestine at the time, do you know?
Yes.
No, before the British?
Ottomans.
The Ottoman Empire. So our uprising was directly against the Ottoman Empire. Why? Because the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, was approached by early Zionists, and for some cash, basically, he said, go ahead. You want to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, go for it, for cash. They gave him money. And of course, they came and started displacing us. In the 1880s, started displacing us. First Palestinian refugees were not 1948. They were in the 1880s. And so, of course, we resisted, and we complained, and we petitioned the government, the Ottoman government, and we lobbied, and there were two Palestinian representatives. One of them happened to be Christian, one of them happened to be Muslim in the Ottoman, the parliament of the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, and they spoke against the Zionist project in Palestine in the 1880s. And one of them was from the Husseini family, actually. And many in actually the Ottoman rulers and the government of the Sultan derided them. They said, oh, what are you worried about? These are people who just want to come here. It's not about the Jewish state or anything like that. They're not going to displace you. You're exaggerating, etc. But they didn't listen to this, and they pushed. And eventually they succeeded. They convinced the Ottoman Sultan that this was a bad project, and it's not just bad for the local native Palestinians, but it's bad for everybody, including Jews, Christian, Muslims in the world, the relationship between religions, the control of the holy sites, etc. And the Sultan was convinced finally, and as a result of that, the Zionist movement was forced to relocate from Vienna to London in 1904, by the way. Why did they relocate their headquarters from Vienna to London in 1904? Because they failed with the Ottoman Empire, and they wanted now to lobby your government in London. So Weizmann and those guys moved to the UK and started lobbying here, and it took them 13 years to get the Balfour Declaration. But in any case, that's real history that delayed the Zionist project by at least 20 years. Imagine if the Ottoman Empire stayed supportive of Zionism, the world history would have changed completely. And I think that the delay was probably the key element in the failure of Zionism today. If they had succeeded in the 19th century, we would be like all the other colonizers who succeeded, whether it's Australia or United States or others. Because the late 19th century, colonialism was looked at very favorably, and nobody really cared about colonialism. After the mid-20th century, things have changed. So Zionism actually suffered a fatal blow, not today, but they suffered it about 100+ years ago, thanks to our resistance. And I'll talk about why I think Zionism actually failed past tense, not will fail, failed already. But this is just one example. I can cite many more examples. Let me give you another example. From 1947, 48, 49, and 50, over a 3.5-year period, the State of Israel was created. And I showed you the villages and towns that were depopulated, those ones here. As Israel was being created, the first military order given by the new government to the State of Israel, the provisional government of the State of Israel, was an order that says to its Haganah and other military forces, shoot any Palestinian who tries to go back to his village and town. Shoot them, okay? And this was, but they called them infiltrators. Of course they were not infiltrated, they come from those villages. When the fighting was going on or whatever, they left. They ran away at the point of the gun. Some of them tried to sneak back into their villages. And Israel, of course, as a new state, wants to be a Jewish state, doesn't want these non-Jews, Christian, Muslim, Baha'i, Druze, whatever they are. So shoot them. And some 5,000 Palestinians were killed as they tried to go back to their homes and lands. 5,000. Now, this is a big sacrifice when you think about it. But what is interesting is that roughly 60,000 Palestinians managed to sneak back and go. This is an act of resistance, of course, civil resistance, against all odds, against this threat to being murdered on sight by any soldier of the new state of Israel had the order to shoot at these infiltrators. Now, 60,000 doesn't sound like a lot of numbers, but as a total of the people who stayed, we're talking about total 150,000, so really 60,000 out of the 150,000. And today, how many Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel are there 72 years later, or 70-some years later? There's 1.5 million. 1.5 million. So imagine if those 60,000 didn't go back. What would have happened? You would have a population of 900,000 Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel instead of 1.5 million. Instead of being called this demographic bomb by the Zionist leaders. So this is a remarkable act of resistance and suffering, of course, and paying a price for this resistance, but with success. And we should celebrate those successes and not forget about them while we describe the atrocities that happened to us. Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, right? We all know this history. And we know that Israel started to build settlements, which you can see on the right-hand side of this picture. But I was 10 years old in 1967. And I remember my mother walking down with me in hand, going around the neighbors and telling them, nobody leaves. She's old enough to have experienced 1948, of course. She was actually 18 years old, or 16 years old, I'm sorry, in 1948. And she had lost a close friend of her, another 16-year-old Palestinian girl named Hayab al-Bisi, in Deir Yassin, in the massacre of Deir Yassin. So she remembers vividly what happened. There were massacres, there were killings, etc. But she went around the neighborhood, and also when she saw people walking down the street, she would get out the door and would go talk to them and say, where are you going? And if they said they are going to Jordan, she said, don't do that, you're crazy. If you do that, the Zionists win. The Zionists win, and we end up where? In refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, etc., and we will never be allowed back. No, stay in your homeland and see what happens. And if they come and kill us, they kill us, but at least we die in our land. And I remember also some people said to her, why don't you put crosses in your house? My mother is not religious. She said, why should I put crosses in my house? I said, well, maybe the Zionists, when they come, they will shoot the Muslims, but will not shoot the Christians. She said, what difference does it make? They shoot me, they shoot my neighbor. We're all the same, Christian, Muslim, whatever. But I don't want to put a cross in my house anyway. I don't believe in this stuff. So anyways, this is how she gave me the impression. But this happened not just by my mother, happened with tens of thousands of Palestinians who convinced most Palestinians not to leave the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. As a result, only 300,000 left the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967. That seems like a lot, but that's compared to a population of 3 million. So very few people left, unlike 1948 when most people were kicked out and left. Now, the fact that Palestinian state in 1967 was very significant, because here Israel came and occupied us in 1967 and ended up stuck with us. They don't know what to do with us. And today, between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, by the way, there are 6.2 million Palestinians and about 6.1 million Israeli Jews. And the Israeli Jews, some of them are native Jews who are with us. And many of them are also even European Jews who are post-Zionist or anti-Zionist, who realize that the Zionist project has failed or is failing. So I would say roughly 1/3 of the Jewish population of Palestine now is either anti-Zionist or post-Zionist. When you add that 1/3 to the other 51%, you get the vast majority of the people who reject the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, of course, I don't want to minimize the fact that we continue to suffer, we continue to lose land. And you have to remember that this whole thing is about land. The Zionists, like any colonialist, they want the land, they don't want the people who come with the land. So they push us out and they squeeze us into these cantons, just like Europeans did in North America, in the US, or in South Africa under apartheid with Bantustan. That's typical of settler colonialism. But also, when you think of it this way, you also can understand the resistance, popular resistance or armed resistance or whatever you want to. When the Europeans came to North America, this is a picture that they drew, for example, about how they brought civilization and technology and democracy and wonders to this savage land. Manifest destiny and all that stuff that they used to speak about, and being also sent by God there and all of this stuff. And of course, these natives and their animals and also the buffaloes, the wild animals, are all cleared. They are running away from this progress and development. And sometimes when they are charitable, they say it's because that we natives just don't understand civilization, and that's why we reject them, okay? But I think anybody rationally can understand why native people who lived in a piece of land for thousands of years don't like the idea of somebody coming and saying, nice, beautiful land, I love this land, but I hate the people who come with the land. It's like saying you love France, but you hate the French people, It's illogical, okay? You either love the country with its people or you don't, You cannot love the land, but not the people who come with the land. But that's what colonialists do. They love the land, they don't love the people who come with the land. And of course, the people who are not loved and who are not wanted are not going to love somebody who hates them. So they resist. And resistance is natural. Now, colonialism can end up in one of these three models, by the way. Settler colonialism can end up in the model of Algeria, or in the model of Australia and the United States, or in the model of the rest of the world, which is coexistence in one country for descendants of colonized, descendants of colonizers. None of these three outcomes is kumbaya or happiness or bliss or beautiful outcome, okay? They all have their problems, but the least destructive of them, of course, and the most common one is the third model. So, and there's no fourth outcome for colonialism. Sorry to disappoint those of you who still have the two states solution, which I call delusion or illusion, as a scenario. I can talk about that if you want also in the question and answer session. But as this frog you can imagine, the native people are not going to just be swallowed, right? They are going to resist. Doesn't mean we are guaranteed winning, but we will resist. And we will resist to reclaim what we believe is rightfully ours, which is a land that our ancestors have been in for thousands of years, since the dawn of civilization, literally, and we were the ones who first had civilizations. For 11,000 years, of course, religions come and go in our country, and we were pagan, and we were Jewish, and we were Christian, and Muslim, and Baha'i, and atheist, whatever. But that's religious belief. It has nothing to do with who the native people are. The native people, actually, there's DNA studies recently done among Lebanese and Palestinians showing that the DNA that we have, and I'm a medical geneticist, I can confirm this, the DNA that we have was compared to DNA from skeletons of Canaanites, and we're the same DNA. It doesn't mean we didn't have intermixing and various people come and go, but the number of the intermixing is very minimal compared to our population. Actually, here is a picture of Palestinian religious and secular leaders who gathered in 1932 in Palestine to resist the Zionist project, resist the idea of a Jewish state. And these you can see why they resisted, because they are diverse. They don't want a Jewish state, including the rabbi that's there and the Samaritan elder there, who are followers of the book of Moses and all of that stuff. They don't accept the idea of transforming this multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious society to make it a Jewish state of Israel. And we resisted also when the Crusaders came. My family resisted with the Muslims and with fellow Jews also against the Crusaders. Not because we didn't like Catholics. We had Catholics, we were Catholics. Some Catholics and some Greek Orthodox and other Christian sects. They all fought with the Muslims. Why? Because again, we don't want this notion of monolithic society. Monolithic societies are not very nice. We know what happens in attempts to do that, like all German, Aryan, Christian, whatever, or all the white, Jim Crow laws in the South. And by the way, as a human being, for the life of me, I could never understand people who want to live with people exactly like they are. I mean, wouldn't that be so boring, so stupid? Hell, I can't even live with myself sometimes. I want to live with people just like me. Life is interesting because of its diversity. I mean, when you have diversity like this, you sit down with a Palestinian, Ethiopian, Christian, or a Samaritan, and you learn about their views and their diets and their life. It's exciting, it's interesting. So, of course, we resist this. And we resisted it very, very early on, as I mentioned in the beginning under Ottoman rules. And when the Rothschilds first funded the first two Zionist colonies, Petah Tikva and Rishon LeZion, in 1880, we engaged in a resistance and an uprising between 1881 and 1889, successfully, as I said. The first woman union was established in the late 1920s, and women in Palestine were very, very critical for resistance. That's why I said somebody needs to write more books about women involvement, because also we see how unfair revolutionary movements treat women, even when they win. Like in Algeria, the women movement was very critical for the resistance against the French, and when they won independence, they were marginalized and men took over, This is not fair. So, anyway, the Palestinian women were very critical for various stages of these successes that we engaged in. And I'll just give you an example. Again, I cannot reiterate all what's in the book, there are too many stories to tell. But this is a story I like to tell because the woman union that was established in 1927, late 27, early 28, started doing actions against the British mandate and against the Balfour Declaration, against the Zionist project, very early on. They even elected the board for the women union. There was 16 women, I think like 6 or 7 of them were Christian and one Jewish and the rest Muslim, majority Muslim. But even when they elected the executive board and the executive board came to elect the president, even though the majority of them were Muslim, they elected this Palestinian Christian woman. Her name is Mati al-Mughannam. She's with the white hat and the purse on the left. And Mati al-Mughannam was a remarkable woman. She wrote a book in 1936, published in London, called The Arab Woman and the Palestine Problem. It should be required reading, actually, in all our universities as a book on feminism and the strength of the women movement in Palestine in the 1920s. For example, in this book, you read about how they organized meetings with the British High Commissioner. That's why they are there in front of a British soldier in 1928, and how the British High Commissioner would not listen to them. This is when they went to meet him. By the way, the women that are wearing the veil, when they went and sat down with the British High Commissioner, this is what Mati al-Mughannam describes in her book. They said the British High Commissioner brought his wife, well, he's meeting women, he needs to bring his wife. So they sat, and then he offered them tea, and they refused. They said, we don't drink tea from our oppressors. You can come and offer us tea when you come as a visitor to a free Palestine. And then he said, okay, what can I do for you? And the women who were wearing those niqabs lifted the niqab up. And he was like shocked. He said, well, this is unusual. And Mati al-Mughannam describes why they did that. He said, those women said to him, look, we want you to look us in the eye and see how seriously mad we are at you and your government. And it was an act. I mean, it was not that they were niqab, it's just that an act that they were going to show him that they are really serious. Anyways, these women, when he didn't listen to them, and of course he gave them the usual diplomatic answer, I'll send a letter to my superior, etc. They said, we're not going to be quiet, we're going to go do something about this. And they went to the streets and did demonstrations. They held, for example, the first demonstration in human history that used cars, automobiles in a demonstration. In October 1928, 120 cars, you can imagine, driving down the old streets of Jerusalem in 1928. What a spectacle that was, including being driven by women, of course. They had to bring cars from as far as Nazareth and Jaffa and Haifa and Beer Sheva. It was remarkable. So this is a kind of success, and it made the London Times newspaper and things like that. When that didn't make an effect, they said we have to do more things. They started writing letters to the editor in the London Times. You can still read those letters from those women in the archives, 1930 and 1931. And then they went and made a delegation, came to London. Perhaps the first time in British history that a delegation of women from a country that the British occupied came and lobbied Parliament and created a few Friends in Parliament, which is the predecessor for the Parliamentary Friends of Palestine that exist today. So they did some success, and the British later in 1930s, as you know, restricted Jewish colonization in Palestine to kind of subside the uprising of 1936 to 39 that we had, and also because they were busy with the Second World War and they didn't want to be fighting the native Palestinians and at the same time fighting the Second World War. So anyway, this is a history that I think needs to be read, needs to be told, needs to be understood in the context, not as a history of failure, but as a history of success. And you can say, okay, this Jewish American woman, this Palestinian woman who lives in England, actually, Rada Karmi, a professor, she wrote a book, by the way, called Married to Another Man. People think it's about infidelity sometimes, but it's because when Herzl sent two rabbis to Palestine in 1897, before they sent their full report to Herzl, they sent him a telegram to Vienna in 1897. The telegram simply said, the bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man. So, anyway, Rada wrote this book about married to another man, but I show this picture because you can say, every picture from now on, the rest of the picture, you can look at it as you look at this glass half full or look at it half empty. You can look at the negative parts of it, and you can look at the positive parts of it. You can look at the slide and say, you know, well, there's still there, the symptom that they're highlighting, and they've been protesting since 1973. And what has changed? Nothing has changed. And, you know, it's horrible, right? Or you can look at it and say, here's decent two human beings who are doing remarkably well, friendship that lasted decades, and they are working their ass off to really make a difference in this world. And that's important. It's very important because that's how the world changes. It doesn't change by wishful thinking. It changes by people acting. And of course, at the time the oppression remains, people say, well, you know, it doesn't look like it's going to have an end. I became involved in activism briefly for South Africa in 1980. I was then president of the International Student Club at University of Connecticut, where I was doing a degree. And the black guy comes to me and he says, you're the president of this club. I said, yes. He said, what are you going to do about South Africa? And I was a naive 21, 22-year-old. I said, what's wrong with South Africa? And of course, he educated me about apartheid and all this racism and stuff like that. And we brought a speaker actually from London who came there. We didn't know it at the time because, but he's a member of the ANC, you know. At the time, of course, the ANC was considered a terrorist organization, both in England and in the US. And so, so we brought him, he spoke there and educated us, and we engaged in BDS. But if you had come to me in 1980 or 81 or 82 or even up to 86 and 87 and asked me, what's going to happen in South Africa? Will you live long enough to see apartheid end in South Africa? I would have told you point blank, I don't expect to see it in my lifetime. And of course it changed not only in my lifetime, but earlier than I even had expected, like 1989, I think, or something like that. And I remember vividly in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected president, and a friend of mine was wearing a black armband, and I asked him why. He explained to me about Ronald Reagan, how horrible he is. So I watched Ronald Reagan's speeches, and the first speech I heard from Ronald Reagan, he mentioned South Africa. I'm like, my ears perked. What is he saying about South Africa? And what he was saying is there's a domino effect, and the communists will take over, and those terrorists like Nelson Mandela and all these guys should be kept in jail forever. That's how Ronald Reagan was, and how most Western leaders are. Of course, after Nelson Mandela died, all the Western leaders trucked into South Africa and said, we've always supported freedom for South Africa, which is nonsense. You know, they all supported apartheid. Not one Western government opposed apartheid. They only opposed it when they were 100%, not 99%, 100% sure that it was going to go down. Then that's what's called, you know, making sure of your bets, so to speak. So anyways, I say this because it is not really relevant what your projection about what's going to happen in the future is related to your actions or not. Your actions should be based on principles, on your conscience, on living with your skin, not in terms of what's going to happen tomorrow or 10 years down the road, or will I live to see it end or not. If you were a slave in North America, or even a white person in North America, in 70 or in the UK in the 16th, 15th century, you know, you had choices. You either opposed slavery, fought against it, even as whites, of course. In North America, there was the railroad, what do you call them, the smuggling of the blacks to the north, etc. As white, you had the choice. You either be a slave owner and be healthy and rich and powerful and have plantations and export your cotton to England, or you could be one of the people who tries to help the black people. And if you were a slave, by the way, you also had the choice. You know that? The choice was either to be a house slave or a field slave. House slave is an obedient slave, does whatever the master tells him to do. He can even dress like the white folks and live in a nice house and even eat with the master at the table, because he's obedient. And this field slave is under a whip. You still have a choice. So, and in either case, you would not have seen the end of slavery. And you would not have projected when the end of slavery has come. So you still had the choice, and every one of us have choices, and they have to make good on these choices. So these women have made choices. And it doesn't matter if they live long enough, I live long enough to see it, and or don't live long enough. Now, for Palestinians inside Palestine, situation is a bit more different. We really have very little choices. We either vacate Palestine, because that's what the Zionists want, or we stay. And we say to exist is to resist, which is the title of my next book. And to exist is to resist, like these girls that are going to school here in Bethlehem, with these tanks there, that's resistance. Or these girls in Hebron trying to get to their class, and they are not allowed, and they sit in the street and have their class, that's resistance. Climbing walls, resisting, tearing down walls, etc., trying to stop the destruction of our land like this. The shepherd woman who goes to the field every day when settlers and soldiers don't want her in those fields because they like the land. Again, they don't like the people who come with the land. That's resistance. And she did this even when settlers put poisoned food for her sheep so that the sheep would die. And we helped her, and others helped her to take out these poison pellets, sitting in front of bulldozers, etc. This is a guy named Umar. His house is actually now on the so-called Israeli side of the wall, and he has a tunnel, which there's a gate, but he's not now allowed to use the tunnel, so basically he's trapped in his house behind the wall. Here, he and his two children were sitting in front of a bulldozer that was clearing his land and his olives to create that wall that isolated his house. And these soldiers picked him up with his two children at the time. One was 7 years old and one was 9 years old, and literally threw them down the hill. And in the process, the soldier's gun gashed one of the kids' heads. And basically he needed stitches. This is Ahd Tamimi, who engaged in resistance in Bilayin and Nabi Saleh starting when she was 9 years old. And she was jailed for 9 months for slapping a soldier. That's resistance, of course. The soldiers were in her yard, wanting to go to her roof, having shot at the cousin of hers, who I think also happened to be maybe her boyfriend at the time. But anyways, they shot him in the head, and she thought he was dead. And here they're coming to go up on her roof and shoot at other children. And she was like, in high school, and they arrested her for slapping the soldier and telling him to get off her yard. These are forms of resistance every day that are engaged in. Every single day we are engaged in these forms of resistance. And of course this resistance carries a very heavy price. Over 100,000 natives have been killed. Over 800,000 of us have been injured. Over 900,000 have been detained or imprisoned. So I like these pictures with the smiling Palestinians who are being arrested. And sometimes we're innovative in the way we provide the resistance. So here, people of Bethlehem dressed as Avatar, people of Avatar. For those of you who watched the film would know why. The international solidarity movement, of course, joined us, and it was founded in my village of Beit Sahour. Beit Sahour, the shepherd's field where the shepherds heard the angels sing, went up to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, is very well known for its non-violent resistance. Actually, I traced our first engagement in 1919, so over 100 years ago, with non-violent resistance against the occupation and colonization of Palestine. But the ISM also protected the Church of Nativity, for example. It was being shelled by the Israelis. Some internationals tried to break the siege on Gaza and were killed, like on this Mazim Marmara, Turkish citizens were killed. Some were injured, like Emily Henkowicz, who lost her eye. Ironically, she was a visual artist, came to draw the demonstrations. And Rachel Corrie, an American student who was killed. Also Tom Herndale, you know, a British citizen. This is me being arrested a few times. And knocked down by this soldier who just came and hit me like this. I was just photographing at the time. But anyways, you know, I lost some friends in the struggle. Also, 19 friends in the past 10 years were killed. These are two brothers and sisters, for example. I knew the family very well, knew them very well. Both very peaceful people who have never hurt a fly even. And they were killed in these demonstrations. Or Basil Araj from the village of Al-Walaja here, he's wearing a t-shirt that I've given him on boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And here we were standing in front of a bus stop. We called it Palestine Freedom Riders to show the racism of the State of Israel. So we got on this bus that's designated for Jewish settlers only, and it was to take us to Jerusalem, and of course they dragged us out of the bus, etc. So, you know, we, Palestinian civil society, has been calling on the international community, begging and pleading with the international community to help us. For example, with boycott, divestment, sanctions, the movement that actually started under the British rule, 1918, when the British ruled Palestine. But that accelerated, and then with the civil society call to action, 2005 was very important to accelerate. And then after that immediately came what's called the Kairos document. Kairos document is Palestinian Christians basically calling on the international community to support us, and the churches in the world to support us, just like they did with South Africa under apartheid, to help accelerate the time that we will end it. Our museum actually is a form of resistance, like the figure in the lower right-hand corner, because our museum and Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability was created with the idea of being a resistance center. And I'm not afraid to say this, and the Israelis don't like us, of course, and they harass us and do all sorts of things. There's brochures for this museum if you're interested, but it's about human and nature sustainability. And our motto is respect. First, we have to respect ourselves. As native people, we cannot internalize what the colonizers want us to internalize. Think about it. What do the colonizers want, whether in North America with the European colonizers or the blacks in South Africa? What did the colonizers want them to internalize? Stephen Biko, by the way, once said, the best weapon in the hand of the colonizer is the mind of the colonized. Why would they want to colonize the mind of the native people? Because they know that that's the most effective weapon to control us, is to make us feel helpless, to make us feel inferior, to make us feel indeed savages, terrorists, whatever they call us, all these terminologies they call the native people. If we internalize that, they have won. So in the civil rights movement in the US, by the way, there used to be a saying in the 1950s and 60s among the black Americans, free your mind and your ass will follow. And I think that's true. You know, first we have to free this. Once we free that, the rest is minor. So that's why I think respect for oneself starts. That's empowerment, that's so on. Once you respect yourself, then you can respect others, including those you differ with in views, and even the colonizers, by the way. I don't hate the colonizers. I think they're wrong, and I think they're racist, and so on, but I don't hate them. I'm not, you know, I don't, I think hate just, of course, you can be angry about what they do to you, but you cannot be hateful to individuals or human beings. You say they're delusional, they're stupid, whatever, but they're not. To me, there's no evil human beings. There's human beings who do evil, and that's an important distinction. So, respect for ourselves, then respect for others, then we can respect nature, animals and plants. And I'm going to skip this because this is just to show you now what we do is a form of resistance. For example, even in research, when we published research on the decline in biodiversity in Bethlehem region, because Israel, as you see, they took hills that are forested and they made them into this concrete jungle, thus destroying habitats and environment. And even research, my students feel that research is a form of resistance. Here, for example, about even changing the diet of the eagle owl in the Bethlehem area shows decline in biodiversity. And the genotoxic effect of Israeli industrial settlements. So a person like Khulud Hamad, a female student of mine who wrote her thesis on this industrial settlement near Salfit, while she is not very political, she won't go out with us in demonstrations. She also has kids. Doing this gave her a sense of empowerment, gave her a sense of, I'm contributing by doing this research on the genotoxicity of the Israeli industrial settlements. Or research on water and issues of water, and how Israel steals our water, etc. I'll skip those. No. This is what the museum does basically every day. When these people go on the field work, I should have mentioned Ron Jesse is in the picture here, Ron Taylor. Is in Mubarak Khretul. He was in the audience 2 days ago. I should have mentioned to him, here you are, a British citizen who come with us to explore a cave, find some bats. And he said, but I'm coming here to help Palestine. I said, you are helping Palestine by helping us study our bats and our mammals and things like that. We also can do things like building things. And I put this picture to remind me to say this. It is not enough for us to say we are against this or against that. It is really important for us to articulate what we want and how we want to build for it. So if our vision is sustainable human and natural community, we need to do that. We need to actually grow our vegetables, grow our food, sustain our life with minimal impact on the environment, not use pesticides, insecticides. So use things like these aquaponic systems or aquaculture, etc., or build green, or work with our children to teach them the value of living things. And you can't imagine how useful it is for a child to learn to take care of an animal or a plant. It is helpful for empowerment, for giving them the sense of can-do attitude. So they learn like to recycle waste like this, or paper, like these girls that we showed them how to recycle these things. These are pictures. All of these I consider are forms of resistance, even though they are not your typical forms of resistance that you see people in demonstrations or carrying banners or whatever. So, having fun, by the way, is a form of resistance. Going in the field like this and enjoying games and enjoying and respecting the environment, which is respect for ourselves. We opened the museum in April 2017, and we opened the Cultural Heritage project, which was funded by the British Council, by the way, in April 2019. And we plan to open a green building in 2021. And this is what the green building will look like when it's finished, hopefully, in 2 years. So, to reiterate what I just said, I think resistance is a spectrum of things. The most important aspect in resistance to colonization is to resist the idea of colonizers, which is to separate the native people from their land. So anything that reconnects us with our land, with our culture, with our heritage, with our roots, and having a museum like this, for example, that teaches people about Palestinian background, etc., is very important. That's also a form of resistance. Education, agriculture, planting an olive tree, teaching a child to distinguish the stages of a butterfly development. All of these are forms of resistance, and we must increase all forms of resistance. And when people ask me, well, what should I do? I say, well, you do what you like to do, first of all, because there are thousands of ways to help. You don't have to do a particular thing or do what I do. My background is biology, so obviously I worked with kids on biology and agriculture and things like that. But if your background is media, work on the media. If your background is music, use music in the resistance. Whatever your background is, whatever your interests are, do it. The key is to do more of it and to organize it and schedule it so that we can have a mass movement, in my humble opinion, that will change the circumstances. And sometimes it's not visible, this mass movement. Sometimes, you know that saying, a straw that broke the camel's back, you know? You don't know the effect of these straws until you reach the last straw. So, but hopefully we won't break the camel's back. But anyways, that's the idea, is to just incrementally keep doing what you're doing, keep chipping at the wall. I went to the Berlin Wall, by the way. I visited the remnants of it, and they were selling pieces of the Berlin Wall. I bought a small piece. I should have brought it with me. It cost me €8 for a very small piece like this. So I tell the Palestinians, why don't we start chipping at the wall now? This looks like good business. So I think maybe I should stop here and have fun, by the way. I enjoy myself all the time. As you can see, I joke and stuff.
Tell the one about them swimming in their shirt, like you did last night.
So that's what I wanted to say. One last thing. I will pass around this sheet if you can sign your email for if you like to be on our email list, we send an email. If you are already on it, you don't have to sign it. We send an email about every week or so, 10 days sometimes, which gives you ideas for action and gives you positive energy. I don't dwell on all the negatives, and if one dwells on all the negative, one becomes negative. But, okay. And I'm happy to take any questions, Mr. Ron.
I'm sure you found that as fascinating as I did. So we're prepared to take any comments or questions.
Feel free to ask a devil's advocate type of questions also. Or I'd like to see if there's any Zionists here. It would be nice to have a more lively discussion.
I can role play if you want.
You can ask it, yeah. Go ahead, ask me. What about Hamas? Hamas?
This is a very specific question. I came across an organisation called Military Court Watch. Are you aware of it?
Mm-hmm.
I was very impressed with what they did and the personalities of the people involved. I wonder if you make any comments.
Well, there's a number of Israeli organizations that work for human rights in Palestine, or try to do different areas. For example, there's also Mazim Watch, which goes to the checkpoints, Israeli women, usually elderly women even, and they stand and try to lecture those soldiers about mistreatment of Palestinians at the checkpoint. In my opinion, of course, this is all important, and everybody who does something, as I said, no matter how they feel its importance and their interest, they should do it. And I encourage them, and it's important also because it shows the Palestinians, it shows the world that not all Israelis are behaving the way their soldiers and their government and their settlers are behaving. And it's important, you know, in South Africa, for example, even though there was a very tiny minority of whites who opposed apartheid, it was still a very important tiny minority because it showed that the struggle was not between blacks and whites. It was between blacks and whites who opposed apartheid and blacks and whites who supported apartheid. The same thing here. It's not a struggle between Israelis and Palestinians. It's a struggle between Israelis and Palestinians and Americans and everybody else who supports human rights and those who oppose it. And there are many who oppose human rights and want racism and want colonialism. So I think the fact that they're small in numbers should not discourage us. It is still a very important segment of the Israeli society, at least symbolically, for what they do. And I myself, when I was arrested over 12 times. Half the times I was arrested with Israeli Jewish citizens who were with me, like when we tie ourselves to a bulldozer or sit in front of a bulldozer.
The other day there was a conference in Haifa of the One Democratic State movement. I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about that and what the prospects are for the future for that movement.
Yeah. I am on the board of the One Democratic State group, and friends of mine everywhere are on it. Israeli Jews, Palestinians from Gaza, Palestinians from 1948 areas occupied when the State of Israel was created. Many others around the world support this movement. It's a logical movement that speaks for human rights. And as I said, you know, when I talked about the outcome for colonialism, there's really one of three possible outcomes. The third outcome, the most common outcome found in the rest of the world, basically, is an outcome that involves coexistence in one democratic country for all its citizens. I say one democratic country because I'm not a nationalist. I don't believe in nation states, by the way. But that's another story, and I'm not going to force my opinion on other people. I think basically for you here, it is not an issue of choice between one democratic state versus two states versus whatever else you can think of. I think the choice is either you support human rights or you oppose human rights. And if you support human rights, you don't have to worry about these terminologies. For example, for those of you who support the two-state solution, you have to tell me that this entails respect and support for human rights of everybody, including the Palestinian refugees returning to their homes and lands. If you allow the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and lands, not to return to the so-called Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, the fictional state, but to return to actual homes and lands that they were kicked out of, if you support that. And of course to be treated equal, to have equal vote and everything else. Then I say, fine, I'll sign on to a two-state scenario if you want. If you say that you oppose human rights, then I don't want to have anything to do with your idea. And I think the problem with many people is they forget this point. And they tend to focus just on the terminology of one state versus two state. First of all, we do have a state, one state now. You realize that. Between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, there's one sovereign state. It's called the State of Israel. And there is no other sovereignty. With all due respects to the delusional Mahmoud Abbas and his entourage of Palestinian authority figures who are talking about ministers and we're Minister of Transportation and President of Palestine. President of Palestine cannot flush his toilet without the Israelis letting the water run. What is this state? You cannot have state under occupation. Or Minister of Transportation who has to get a permit from the Israelis to go from one place to another, let alone has authority to build a road or anything else. And just recently the Israelis even demolished homes in Area A, as you know, that are supposed to be nominally under Palestinian control. But it's not control because, I say Palestinian authority is a misnomer. There's no Palestinian in it. Because Palestine is known. Geography, we know what Palestine is. Between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, that's Palestine. And authority, they don't have authority. They don't have authority on anything. So I think, it's talk about human rights is our best bet. If you want a roadmap to peace, by the way, in Palestine/Israel, if you want to use that terminology. I don't, because I don't recognize the State of Israel, and I will never recognize the State of Israel as a state. But if you use that terminology and you want peace there, I have a roadmap for you. It's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Take it and implement it. Israel violates every single article in the Universal Declaration. Force it to implement it, you solve the problem. They had a roadmap that was written by the lobbyists in Washington under George Bush II, called the Roadmap to Peace in the Middle East. Have you ever read this document? It's a remarkable document, 2,218 words. It's easy to count them now with this, software. And in those 2,218 words, do you know what the words that are missing there? I challenge you to look it up.
Human rights.
Human rights, two of them. There's two others that are missing. International law. How can you have a roadmap to peace that ignores human rights and international law? Actually, the US ambassador in the UN, even just last week, he said international law is irrelevant to the Palestinian-Israeli question. And I'm like, how could you be representing the United States at the United Nations and say that international law is irrelevant to any issue, not let alone the Israeli-Palestinian question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the UN actually, and the role of the UN. Do you feel that the UN is toothless and like the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights?
Well, I have mixed feelings about the UN. The UN was established, as you know, just like the League of Nations, following a war, and was established by the winners, not by the losers. And so the winners had to maintain their continued hegemony, if you want. So they created a system, just like after the First World War, and the reason the League of Nations failed is the same reasons this UN is failing in its mandate, is they created a system, for example, with the UN Security Council, where that's where the decisions are made, and there's 5 countries who have veto power, including the United States, which is the biggest perpetrator of violence in the history of humankind, in my humble opinion, not just in the history of this era. And that's what actually Martin Luther King said the same thing. The US is the biggest perpetrator of violence on earth. And indeed, if you look at the number of people killed directly or indirectly by the US, it's far more than any other country, including, by the way, Nazi Germany. I'm sorry to say. It's horrible what they have done in Cambodia and Vietnam and all these other countries. Latin America alone, millions and millions of people. People forget that. So this country, the US, basically a rogue nation in my humble opinion, and I am free to criticize it also as a US citizen, because I consider part of the privilege I got by getting my education in the US and them giving me citizenship. One of the privileges should be the privilege to criticize my government, what I consider my government, just like you have the privilege you should exercise of criticizing your government. And the US government is horrible. And for them to use the veto power more times than any other country, and all other countries combined actually. All the other 4 countries combined, if you add our veto power at the UN, the US used it more than the other 4. And of all these times that they used the veto power, they used it to protect Israel 5 times more than they used it to protect themselves even, believe it or not. Of course, they violated international law, for example, in Vietnam, when they used Agent Orange and collective punishment. All the stuff, they used the veto power to protect themselves. But they used it more times to protect Israel than they used to protect themselves. And so that's why I say the UN has a problem, a major problem. Despite all what I just said, I still think there is hope. There's hope of some rationality at the UN. But whatever hope there is, that's the hope, that's the part of the UN that the US and Israel fight with tooth, nail, as they say, very bloody war on these parts of the UN, like UNESCO, for example, or the UN Council on Human Rights. The UN Council on Human Rights, there's a war declared on it by the US and Israel. Why? Because it tries to be fair and say, okay, Iran violates human rights in certain aspects, Saudi Arabia violates. Oh, wait a minute, you can't talk about Saudi Arabia, they're our friend, they're giving us oil cheap and we sell them weapons, so don't talk about Saudi Arabia. Let them cut off these journalists with a chainsaw and whatever. That's not a problem, we shouldn't talk about that. Or Israel, which is, killing children. I mean, literally shooting children like ducks in a barrel, Children even in the back and in the head as they were running away. There's evidence of this, overwhelming evidence from every single human rights organization. Beit Sahour, even Israeli organization, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, even the UN Commission on Human Rights itself wrote reports about this. But no, you can't criticize Israel because Israel is our friend. So the US declares war on these reports and on these organizations. So I think what we need to do to balance is we need to do the opposite of what they do. We need to prop up these aspects of the UN And we need to challenge the other aspects of the UN that we don't like, including the veto power that the US uses.
You answered most of what I was going to ask when you talked about the Palestine Authority. I was going to ask about that, but there's an important second part, which is that within the Palestine Solidarity activist movement here, many people sort of campaign for recognition of the Palestine state now. I think it's a mistake, and I oppose it, but I'd be interested in your views. There's corollaries of that, which is like people who want to bring Hassan Zumlat, who's the Palestinian so-called ambassador, say to Wales to meet the assembly, because I'm from Wales. I'm not even sure that that's a good thing, but of course the argument is, well, they're the only official representatives who are recognised. So what do you think, those are good actions to take, or we should not do those actions?
Well, I think one could use this in the following way. If I was to write to a member of parliament or to the prime minister today, I would say, you have two choices. If you claim you are for a two-state solution, you have two choices. One is you either withdraw the recognition of the State of Israel, or you recognize two states and demand Israel give the freedom to the state that's under its thumb, and you sanction Israel until it gives the freedom. But if you don't do that, you're hypocritical by saying you support two states, but you recognize Israel, you don't recognize Palestine. So I think can be said in this fashion without me saying I support two-state solution. I don't, because I don't even think it's a solution. I think, as I said, it's a delusion or an illusion. But they say they support it. The British government says that they are for a two-state solution. Okay, if you say you're for a two-state solution, show me, prove it. How can you recognize the State of Israel and have the EU has most favored nation state with Israel? They get all these. Okay, if you say you are for two states, you should cut off aid to Israel, withdraw your recognition of Israel until a Palestinian state has existed. And if you don't do that, then you are hypocritical. And so it's easy to challenge them like this more than it is to say, but I don't spend a lot of my energy on these areas. I spend more of my energy on boycott, divestment, sanctions, etc., and more than on speaking to Palestinian Authority or reiterating their language.
If you have something like a positive vision for the area, without wanting to use a name of a country or anything, what would that be?
A positive what?
A positive vision.
Vision.
I mean, the wall's going down, or how would, in an ideal world, what would it look like, let's say, in one generation from now?
Right. My vision is not a vision that's, unrealistic. It's a vision that exists, and we are living it as people. As I am here with you, by the way, I have about 9 or 10 volunteers at the museum. The chief volunteer at the museum today is a woman named Zohar Regev, an Israeli woman, who helped organize the boats to Gaza. I met her actually on the boat to Gaza. And we have Americans, we have British, we have other people from various parts that are volunteering at the museum. Our vision is to realize it right now, to do it right now, not to wait for some distant future. We have to really seize the moment, take the people who are willing to work with us for human rights, for justice, for coexistence, for equality. And these terms should not be something that we toss out like this. They should be practiced on the ground, So that's my vision. My vision is basically Palestine has always been, as I told you, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious society, as that picture of 1932 shows you. And it is still like this. So I take this opportunity to say that despite all the efforts by the Zionists over the past 130 years, they have failed miserably at transforming Palestine and destroying They even tried to expropriate our food, by the way, the hummus and falafel and shawarma. They want to make it Israeli food. Sorry, you know, people are smarter than that, and they're not going to fall for it. The Israeli Airlines, when it was formed first, they took Palestinian embroidered dresses like this, made them for the stewardesses on the airplanes, and the Israeli Al Al Airlines. Cultural appropriation, as we call it. This is failing miserably. I don't want to emphasize how miserable they are failing. In fact, the racist laws they are introducing in the Knesset and passing them in the past few years is an indication of how desperate they are, not an indication of success or self-confidence. When you introduce a law, supposedly from the Knesset, it says Israel is the country of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people have a right to Jewish people everywhere have a right to self-determination in Israel, and only the Jewish people have the right to self-determination in this country. Such a law is not needed, by the way. There's already racist laws on the book that cover everything we need for them to do whatever they want to do with us. But it shows their desperation. They are instituting racist laws to self-validate. And I think we have to take that as an act of encouragement, that it's a country in decline. It's a state of racism in decline. The same way as South Africa became more and more racist before apartheid ended, the same way is happening here. So my vision is, you know, and if you want easy answer, you can take whatever the Zionists are pushing for, do the reverse of it. Okay, that would be what we want. Sometimes they simplify it for us. For example, in Herzliya conference, which I read, by the way, and I watch what they say in the Herzliya conference, where they have the elites of Israeli societies come. I watch it every year. Why do I watch it? I watch it to see what they are paranoid about. And I say, that's the one that's doing well. We should do more of this.
Yeah, I was interested in what you said about the international thing, because I've pondered that on for a long time. What's the truth about ISIS standing for Israeli Secret Intelligence Service?
About what?
ISIS standing for Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. The fact that I know my eldest son, I'm calling him now, but he was on very much about this conspiracy theory business and about how Israelis actually despise Gentiles and they try and destroy Gentile societies all over the world, etc. It's very subtle, and you know what you mentioned about Zionism and all that, and etc. etc. Can you give us more information about it? Because I also saw something on Facebook about the Boer War was to do with the Rothschilds and money after the gold mines in Transvaal, just like the Second Iraq War was after the oil in southern Iraq, and they're still prospecting for oil in southern Iraq while the Iraqis have political power, in the same way that when they conquered the Transvaal, the Liberal government here gave them self-government, majority rule in South Africa, and they still control the economy of the country.
Right.
So can you explain all these things, because I'm interested in that.
I mean, I think the best indication, if you want to read more about these things, is go to WikiLeaks. That's why there's a war on WikiLeaks, by the way, because these are, nobody denies these documents, by the way. Not the US government, not the Israeli government, or any government denies that these are actual telegrams and actual correspondence, and they were very clear in these documents about support for terrorist organizations in Syria, for example, that they have supported those. Israel no longer denies it. Actually, you can read a lot of this information, even in Israeli papers like Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post. You can read them actually more in the Hebrew versions of these newspapers than in the English version, because they don't want to expose their dirty laundry to the English-speaking world. But there is documents on this. There's a guy named Israel Shahak who used to translate Hebrew documents into English and publish them. He died, unfortunately. He was a chemistry professor at the Hebrew University. We need more Israelis to translate the Hebrew documents and put them out. But even from what's available now in the English language, you can still find a lot of documents that show this, that show, for example, that in the Golan Heights, Israel was treating the terrorists and sending them back to Syria to fight the Syrian army and so forth. And these are people who are supposed to be the jihadist, Islamist, whatever that the Zionists always make Islam the boogeyman. Well, okay, you know, then why do you train them? Why do you send them there? Why do you give them weapons? I think also, even if you don't have these documents, you can think of it logically, you know. Logic is a very powerful thing that we have. If you believe in God, God gave us this mind to use. And if you believe humans are evolved, Homo sapiens, we have a mind to use. A mind to use is very easy to think about it. For example, you know, when Mr. Netanyahu himself, after September 11 attacks, came and said, you know, this is good for Israel. He said it, it's there, it's recorded. So, what does that mean it's good for Israel? Explain to me how a terrorist attack is good for Israel. Well, you know, nobody questioned. The problem is the media is not doing its job, which is investigative journalism as they used to do in the 1950s and 60s. Investigative journalism requires taking leads and following them up. So the media should do that, and it's not doing that. In the West, the media has dropped the ball and doesn't investigate these connections and who established ISIS and why, and all of this. And I may not have the answer myself. I've never looked into it with the documents in detail. I have far too many things in my hand. But certainly there's a lot of information that people should follow up and investigate on various areas. False flag operations. We know Israel did commit false flag operations, declassified now. For example, the Lavon affair in Egypt, when Israeli intelligence agents bombed British and American interests in Egypt to try to blame them on the nationalists. This is declassified and it's available and it's true. And Israel has never said, I will never do this again. No, they said, this is normal intelligence operation to put bombs and blame it on other people. And when the Mossad participated in putting bombs in front of synagogues in Iraq, in Baghdad, in the 1950s, this is admitted, this is all available. You know, there are lots of information not available in many other areas, but this is available. When you bomb synagogues and Jewish community centers to scare the Iraqi Jews to leave to Palestine, you know, look who profits from what happens. Who profits from the attack on newspapers that are mocking Prophet Muhammad or whatever. I mean, it's obvious who profits. So I think we need to be smarter about it and investigate it. I don't know all the answers. I don't know how many are there false flag operations, but there are ex-CIA agents who say that a lot of the terrorism today is perpetuated by governments, not by rogue groups. And that's CIA agents who say this.
Yeah.
Let me just take one more commenting question because it's about approaching 9, and Mazin's had a very long day. Sheila, again.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your speaking tonight. It's really uplifting. I want to make a kind of a comment, and I want to know whether you would agree with me that one of the biggest mistakes that the Zionists that took power in Israel, Palestine, whichever we want to categorize it as, was the misunderstanding of the nature of the Palestinian population. And I think, for myself, I think Palestine will never ever be dead as long as there is one Palestinian somewhere in the world. It's impossible to actually, they have tried very hard, and as you said, failed completely, to actually root out Palestinians from Palestine. And I think that, from my point of view, is one of their biggest errors. What do you think?
Well, I also don't want to make Palestinians look this wonderful people, whatever. I mean, we're like people like any other, any the Irish, the British, the Israelis, the Americans. We have our idiots, we have our greedy people, we have our smart people, we have our revolutionary people. It's a spectrum, okay? And so it's like any other people. And I think, you know, I don't want to put on the Palestinians more than what the population can. And certainly we had Palestinian collaborators with Israel and who helped create the State of Israel. And so we really need to be realistic in describing our own population and who we are, and we should not try to idolize Palestinians as these poor, helpless victims and who resisted beautifully and everything is fine. No, I'm sorry, you know, in South Africa also, the same thing with the black people. There were 32 factions. Some of them were doing really horrible things also, like either collaborating with apartheid or putting rubber tires around people, burning them alive. You know, it's common to have that variation in a population. And I cannot claim that even my own relatives, I could show you some really, really bad people that do really bad things, you know. So I think we have to just stick with looking at the principles and look at where we are heading. And I think the biggest mistake that Zionists did was not underestimating the local people. They were actually very well organized about the local people. The biggest mistake they made was the timing. The timing. Because if they had done what they were, as some Zionists started very early on in the 19th century, if they had done it 200 years ago or 300 years ago, they may have gotten away with it. But that's the biggest mistake. That's the Achilles heel that brought them down, is a timing issue. And because also you can think about how populations increased in the 20th century with discovery of vaccines and healthcare and so forth. We used, like in the First World War, we lost like almost a quarter of our population. That's more than we lost in the Nakba and all the other catastrophes that combined us, because of lack of adequate healthcare at the time. So their timing was bad. It's just their timing was really bad. And for that, one should feel sorry for them. No, I'm optimistic, and I think, I hope in my lifetime I will see it, unless I have a heart attack in the next few months or something. I think in a few years, maybe 10 years at best, we will see a change, dramatic change here, as we saw it unexpectedly with the Berlin Wall and with South Africa and with the decline of the Soviet Union and everything else we witnessed in our lifetime. But we can all accelerate it a little bit. Even if you accelerate it one day, you're helping save lives. Because every day there are lives being destroyed, homes being demolished, people being killed. So everything you can do now is helpful for shortening this period. Even by one day, it's still worth the effort. So while I'm confident 100% that we will, and I don't say win, because there's no win-win, you know, in a colonial, anti-colonial struggle, but I think we will have the least horrible outcome reduced. So we can do it with your effort, with my efforts, everybody's efforts, working together. So I urge you to come volunteer with us. As I said, there's brochures here for the museum. You can donate to the museum in the US, but in the UK and the US. It's tax deductible, or whatever you call it, gift aid, charity donation as Friends of Bethlehem University. I believe so strongly in what we do. We believe, Jesse and I and others who volunteer with us, that we are full-time volunteers at this museum. And not only that, but we donated what we saved in the US. We donated $250,000 to this museum, to Bethlehem University, to get it started. So I'm not asking you to donate 250,000, but if you have them, we would welcome them. But donate what you can, and we would appreciate it.
Mazin, your positivity is astounding and a great example of Palestinian samud, steadfastness. However, things are getting worse on the ground. I was there only a month ago. Do you think that the combination of the deal of the century, the house demolitions, Gaza, the whole tinderbox effect is going to lead to another intifada?
Yeah. No, I don't deny the bad things that are happening, and the geopolitical situation that we face, especially since the last 25, 30 years, really, that began with the attack on Iraq in 1991, has made things much worse as the Western imperial powers try to reshape the Middle East to fit their agendas, which used to be about the agenda promoting their economic interests, but it is no longer economic interests of nations that determine the future, because economic interests of nations have become subservient to these multinational corporations that are making all the money. And when people tell me, you know, the US, for example, about Iraq was for national interest, sorry, it was not for American national interest. Yes, companies like Halliburton profited handsomely, billions of dollars, their stock went up, and their profits and all of this after the wars on Iraq and so forth. But Halliburton is not an American company, I'm sorry to say. Even their headquarters was moved from Virginia to the United Arab Emirates recently. So they're not even employing American secretaries now. So it's really this multinational corporation whose CEOs and people like Dick Cheney and others, and designers that are in big power structures of these companies, profit regardless of what happens to America. Even if America goes down the drain, they'd still be fairly satisfied, because they could find other countries that will host them. This is a roundabout way to say that yes, we face a very, very big challenge. It's not an easy challenge. It's a challenge not at the level of Palestine only. Palestine is actually a small potatoes compared to others. But why is Palestine important? Palestine is important because it shows the hypocrisy of Western governments. It's the Achilles heel, in the same way that South Africa was the Achilles heel of Western governments in the 1980s. When they used to speak about democracy and human rights and all this stuff and international law, and they were supporting apartheid in South Africa, any rational human being can say these guys are hypocrites. It's a land of hypocrisy. So it's easy to use Palestine, I would say, to point out this Achilles heel of Western hypocrisy and imperialism. This is important. That's why Palestine is important as a point. That's why you see Palestinian flags in Brazil at the World Social Forum. That's why you see them in India. Even I was invited by the lower caste in India to speak at Mumbai. Hundreds of people showed up to hear me speak about it. I asked them, well, Mumbai has like 1 million people on the streets. They are literally starving to death, and there's a truck that comes and collects dead people off the streets. Their situation is worse than Palestine. They said, aha, but Palestine is easier to use against Modi and his friend Benjamin Netanyahu than for us to use our situation against them. Because it's so obvious, it's so clearer, it's so blatantly hypocritical for them to speak about human rights when they don't recognize that. So I think the world is rallying to use us as an example, and that's fine. But I would say, and I said this earlier, that increasingly there's no issue on earth that is isolated from other issues. All issues are connected. That's why you find Donald Trump friend is Boris Johnson, whose friend is Modi in India, whose friend is Benjamin Netanyahu, and you find that Boris Johnson, one side of his family is Zionist, Jewish Zionist, and that he went to a kibbutz and volunteered at a kibbutz. You see that these things are, the enemy is connected. They're all connected out there plotting to destroy the common people and keep getting rich and richer. So our job is to unite our forces, and for that we use different examples. It doesn't have to be Palestine. You can use Zapatistas in Mexico or whatever. We need to use that to modify. But in terms of optimism, sorry, I diverted quite a bit from your original question. In terms of why I think that despite all what's happening, we are winning. The biggest evidence of this is what's happening in Yemen and Syria. Please watch what's happening in Yemen and Syria. Syria and Yemen were slated to be Iraq and Libya of the Middle East. The next Iraq and the next Libya. But the world is waking up big time. And even great powers like China and Russia are waking up to this. And China and Russia said, you're not going to do to Syria what you did in Libya. And create a basket case so that you can get the oil of Libya. And so they put their foot down, and the world is putting its foot down. And Iran is a big factor in this, Russia, China, etc. The world geopolitics is shifting very quickly so that Israel and the United States are no longer going to be able to get their way all the time. Sorry, but it's finished. They have lost big time in Syria, big time. And it was very, very important. And Yemen, they are losing now. As we speak, actually, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are fighting among each other now, which indicates that, when, you know how they say, success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan. You know, when they fail, nobody wants to take credit for it. So they are saying, it's your fault, and now it's your fault, and so on and so forth. So I think the power of the empire is going down, and we need to rethink our strategies, and instead of them using divide and conquer against us, we should be using divide and conquer against them. That's why I love Donald Trump, by the way, because he is dividing things.